It is, it's one of the supreme ironies of human history that the substance responsible for so much death and geopolitical upheaval over the last 1,000 years was originally invented by people who were, like, literally trying to cure ailments and live forever.
Yeah, it really is a profound paradox. I mean, we are talking about a chemical mixture that completely rewired the map of the world, right?
Yeah.
But its origins are entirely accidental. It was just a byproduct of a search for a magical elixir of life.
Exactly. And welcome to a brand new deep dive, by the way. Today, we're pulling from a massive repository of historical and chemical data to look at a single world-altering substance, which is gunpowder.
Yes, the big one.
And the mission for you, the listener, today is to look past the obvious, straightforward battlefield applications. We want to really understand the accidental chemistry that makes it work, the bizarre historical supply chain logistics, and the surprisingly weird everyday uses of a powder that reshaped human civilization.
So to start, we really need to define what gunpowder, or black powder, as it's often called, to distinguish it from modern smokeless powders, what it actually is.
Right.
It is the earliest known chemical explosive, but its unique superpower isn't about exploding in the way we usually think of it. It doesn't actually detonate, it deflagrates.
Wait, so it's not actually exploding? Because, when I see a historic cannon fire in a movie, it looks like a massive explosion. It definitely sounds like one.
Oh, sure, it looks and sounds like one, but the physics are completely different. So high explosives like TNT or C4, those detonate. They undergo a supersonic reaction, creating this massive shockwave that violently shatters whatever is around them.
Okay, so a shattering effect.
Right. If you put TNT in a cannon barrel, you wouldn't shoot a cannonball. You would just blow the steel barrel into, like, 1,000,000 pieces of shrapnel. Gunpowder, on the other hand, deflagrates, meaning it burns at subsonic speeds.
So it's really just burning incredibly fast.
Yes, exactly. And when you pack it tightly into a confined space, like behind a heavy iron projectile in a gun barrel, that rapid burning generates a sudden, enormous volume of hot gas.
And that gas has to go somewhere.
Precisely. The pressure builds up instantly and takes the path of least resistance, which means it violently pushes the shot out of the muzzle. It's a propellant. It pushes rather than shatters.
Okay, let's unpack this, because to understand how this perfect propellant was discovered, we have to travel back to 9th century China during the Tang Dynasty.
Right, the early alchemists.
Yeah, you have Taoist alchemists who are essentially the cutting-edge scientists of their day. And they're mixing all sorts of minerals, herbs, and animal parts, trying to find a potion for immortality. And the Chinese name they eventually gave this substance, huyao. It literally translates to fire medicine.
Which is incredibly fitting, considering the earliest written accounts we have of it are essentially medical safety warning.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there is a 9th century text called the Zhenyuan Miaodao Yao Lui, and it documents how some early alchemists were heating a mixture of sulfur, realgar, saltpeter, and honey.
Okay. Let's look at those ingredients, because they are wild. Honey, I assume, is just a sticky binder or like a source of carbon. But realgar.
Yeah, so realgar is an arsenic sulfide mineral. It is highly toxic.
Oh, wow.
So these alchemists are literally throwing poison, sugar, and fertilizer into a hot pot. And the text notes the result of this particular experiment rather tragically. It says smoke and flames erupted, the alchemists' hands and faces were burnt, and the entire house where they were working basically burned to the ground.
I mean, that is the ultimate do not try this at home warning, right? Read 1,000 years ago.
Totally.
So what was actually happening in that burning house? Let's talk about the chemistry, because you can't just throw those random materials in a bowl and conquer the world. It's like baking the world's most dangerous cake. If you use pure carbon instead of partially decomposed wood charcoal, it barely lights up like a match head. The baking process has to be exact.
Yes, the reaction requires an incredibly precise chemical trinity. The classic gunpowder recipe eventually stripped away the arsenic and the honey and settled on 3 vital ingredients.
Right.
First, you need saltpeter, which is potassium nitrate. This acts as the oxidizer. It fundamentally supplies the oxygen for the chemical reaction, which is why gunpowder doesn't need ambient air to burn. It literally brings its own oxygen to the party.
That makes sense. And second is the fuel, which is charcoal, and the third is sulfur. But earlier you mentioned the sulfur acts almost like a kindling to lower the ignition temperature. How does that actually do that?
Well, this is where the physical chemistry gets pretty brilliant. Sulfur has a very low melting point around 115 degrees Celsius. So when you introduce a spark to gunpowder, the sulfur melts almost instantly into a liquid.
Okay.
And that liquid sulfur coats the other ingredients, creating this combustible medium that allows the fire to spread through the entire mixture in a fraction of a second.
And what about the charcoal? Because I know you can't just scrape pure carbon off a burnt log and expect it to work.
Right, you can't. The charcoal used for gunpowder is partially pyrolyzed cellulose. Basically, the wood is baked without oxygen, but it isn't completely decomposed into pure carbon.
So this still has some structure to it.
Exactly. That specific partial breakdown leaves the microscopic cellular structure of the wood intact. It creates a highly porous material, almost like a microscopic sponge.
Oh, I see.
So when you grind everything together, the saltpeter crystals get lodged deep inside the high surface area pores of that charcoal sponge. The liquid sulfur coats it, the saltpeter provides the oxygen, and the charcoal burns furiously.
And the ideal ratio they eventually settled on was what, about 75% saltpeter, 15% charcoal, and 10% sulfur?
That's right. But the reaction isn't clean. When this deflagration happens, it leaves behind a massive physical byproduct. Combustion actually converts less than half the mass of the gunpowder into pushing gas.
Wait, really? Less than half?
Yeah. The rest becomes particulate matter, a tremendous amount of solid waste. It produces a dense, thick smoke, which, famously would blind armies and give away a soldier's position on the battlefield.
Right, the classic smoky battlefield paintings.
But the unseen problem is the soot left inside the gun barrel. That soot contains potassium oxide, which is highly hygroscopic.
Meaning it pulls water straight out of the air.
Yes, it actively absorbs atmospheric moisture, turning into potassium hydroxide. And potassium hydroxide is incredibly caustic. It actively eats away at iron and steel.
Oh, man. So firing a gun meant you were literally lining your barrel with a corrosive paste.
Precisely. Gunpowder was an absolute nightmare to clean and maintain, which is a major reason why militaries were so desperate to replace it with modern smokeless powders in the late 19th century.
But, before modern chemistry could replace it, this fire medicine had to conquer the globe. And the weapons evolved rapidly in China.
They really did.
By the 10th century, they were attaching it to fire arrows. By the 12th century, during the Jinsong Wars, they developed fire lances, which were bamboo tubes filled with powder that shot flames and bits of shrapnel at the enemy.
Sort of an early shotgun.
Yeah, exactly. And then by 1288, we have archaeological evidence of the Heilongjiang hand cannon. And that's a true cast metal gun with a chamber and a touch hole.
Right. The technological evolution inside China is very well documented. Where it gets incredibly murky is tracing exactly how it reached the rest of the world.
The great historical mystery.
Yeah, it spread across Eurasia, and most historians agree the Mongols were the primary vector for this transmission. By the period between 1240 and 1280, the Islamic world had fully integrated it. A Syrian scholar named Hassan al-Rama wrote a military treatise containing like 107 different gunpowder recipes.
And he referred to the main ingredient, saltpeter, as Chinese snow, which leaves a pretty massive breadcrumb trail as to where he got it.
It does. He also described fireworks as Chinese flowers, but Al-Rama's text is famous because it contains an illustration of what is essentially a medieval torpedo.
A medieval torpedo.
Yeah, he called it the egg which moves itself and burns. It was a pear-shaped vessel filled with gunpowder and metal filings, propelled by a large rocket, and it was designed to glide across the surface of the water and slam into enemy ships.
Okay, hold on. You were giving me incredibly specific diagrams for a rocket-propelled torpedo in Syria in the 1200s. But earlier we were talking about guys holding bamboo sticks shooting sparks.
Right.
How do we actually know when a flaming stick officially became a gun? Or when a firecracker became a torpedo? Like, if a chronicler writes about a long lance shooting evil-smelling smoke at the Battle of Mohi in 1241, how do historians actually know if that's a cannon, an early gas attack, or just a really smoky stick?
Isn't tracing this a total guessing game?
It is the absolute bane of military historians. The academic term for it is semantic change, and it creates a total etymological nightmare.
How so? Well, when a totally unprecedented technology appears, people almost never invent a brand new word for it immediately. They repurpose an old word that describes something similar.
Oh, like how we use dialing a phone, even though rotary dials haven't existed for decades.
Precisely. That's a perfect example. In Arabic texts, the word naft originally meant naphtha, which was an older incendiary liquid like Greek fire.
Right.
But later, naft was used to mean gunpowder. So when you read a 13th century battle account that says soldiers threw naft, you have to guess. Are they throwing liquid fire or explosive powder?
That's fascinating.
And the Chinese word pow went through the exact same transition. It originally meant a mechanical stone-throwing catapult. Later, it was repurposed to mean cannon. So translating these ancient texts is just fraught with ambiguity.
The linguistic fog of war. But regardless of what they called it, the spread was undeniable. It reached India, again likely via the Mongols. And centuries later, the Sultanate of Mysore was using advanced bamboo rockets against the British.
Right, the famous Mysorean rockets.
Yeah, the ones from Tipu Sultan, which were essentially bamboo tubes, tightly bound with iron to hold massive pressure.
Which, by the way, directly inspired the rockets the British later used to bombard Fort McHenry in the United States.
And the rocket's red glare. That traces straight back to Indian gunpowder technology.
It absolutely does.
And in Southeast Asia, after a failed Mongol invasion of Java in 1293, the locals captured the technology and scaled it up to a terrifying degree. I mean, by the 16th century, the Javanese were casting bronze sacred cannons that weighed up to 8 tons.
8 tons of bronze.
Right. Just imagine the sheer heat, the massive infrastructure, and the engineering required for a medieval society to cast an 8-ton piece of bronze just to harness the expanding gas of this ancient fire medicine.
It's an incredible feat. But here is the logistical reality, which we have to talk about. Knowing the 75 15-ton recipe and building a giant cannon was really only half the battle. Making the gunpowder reliable enough to mass produce and actually transport to a battlefield required a massive leap in processing technology.
Okay, let's talk about the nightmare of serpentine powder. Because in early Renaissance Europe, gunpowder was mixed dry.
Right.
The ingredients were ground together into a fine, flour-like dust. But think about how armies traveled back then. They are moving in heavy wooden carts pulled by horses over incredibly bumpy, rutted dirt roads for weeks at a time.
And the vibration was the enemy. If dry, dusty gunpowder vibrated in a barrel during transport, the ingredients physically separated based on their density.
Just from shaking.
Yeah, the heavy sulfur sank to the bottom of the barrel, and the light charcoal powder vibrated to the top. The mixture was completely ruined.
So the artillery crews arrive at a siege, open a barrel, and find a layer of useless charcoal on top. What did they actually do?
They had to remix the powder in the field. Right before a battle, gunners would lay out tarps and use wooden shovels to blend the explosive dust back together.
While cannons are actively firing around them, a stray spark in a cloud of explosive dust would be catastrophic.
It was incredibly hazardous. The solution to this didn't arrive until the late 14th century with a processing upgrade called corning.
Corning?
Yes. Powder makers realized that if they wet the powder during the grinding phase, sometimes using water, or often distilled spirits, it turned into a damp paste.
Oh, okay.
They would then take this paste and force it through a sieve or a screen, forming little uniform clumps or corns. Once these clumps dried, they stayed perfectly bound together. The sulfur couldn't sink.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. So they made it into little solid clumps. But wait, why would making it clumpy make it burn faster and more powerfully? Wouldn't a fine dust catch fire much easier than a dense rock of powder?
Well, think about packing an espresso machine. If you take coffee dust and you tamp it down incredibly hard into a solid, tight brick in the portafilter, what happens to the water when you turn the machine on?
It chokes. The water just sits on top because it can't find a path through the dense dust.
Exactly. Fire acts the exact same way in a dense dust. But if you have coffee ground perfectly, or in this case, gunpowder formed into tiny uniform corns, what do you naturally have sitting between those corns?
Air gaps.
Yes. The physical shape of the clumps creates perfect microscopic air gaps throughout the entire barrel. When you introduce a spark, the hot gas and the flames flash through those air gaps instantly, igniting every single grain of powder at the exact same millisecond.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Corning didn't just solve the transport problem, it increased the explosive power of the gunpowder by 30 to 300%. It completely changed the reaction dynamics.
Okay, so corning perfects the physical shape of the powder, but you still need mountains of raw ingredients. And this brings us to the great barnyard hustle.
Wow, this is fascinating.
Right, because charcoal and sulfur were relatively easy to mine or burn. Saltpeter was the ultimate bottleneck. It doesn't just grow on trees. It naturally forms from decomposing organic matter reacting with alkaline soil.
And France had a particularly severe crisis with this. Unlike Britain, which controlled massive saltpeter imports from India, the French crown had to source it domestically.
Right.
For hundreds of years, they relied on a deeply unpopular group of men called the saltpetermen. These royal agents operated under a warrant called the droit de feu, which translates to the right to dig.
And they weren't digging in pristine mines, were they? They were digging in the poorest places imaginable.
The most nitrous-rich soil is found in places saturated with animal or human waste, so peasants' barnyards, stables, cellars, and dovecotes.
Wow.
These saltpetermen had the legal authority to walk onto your private farm, tear down the walls of your stable, and dig up the dirt underneath your animals to boil it down for saltpeter. And they didn't have to compensate you for the damage.
Imagine a government agent knocking down your garage just to scrape the dirt underneath it to fund a war. The corruption must have been rampant.
Oh, it was. Wealthy landowners would simply bribe the saltpetermen to bypass their estates, which meant the burden of the military supply chain fell entirely on the poorest, most vulnerable farmers in France.
It was a bureaucratic and social nightmare. But that all changed in the 1770s, right? Thanks to Antoine Lavoisier. Today, we revere Lavoisier as the father of modern chemistry. He discovered the role oxygen plays in combustion. But at the time, he was a lawyer and a tax collector, and the king appointed him to head the French Gunpowder Administration.
Yes, and he looks at this chaotic, destructive system of tearing up peasants' farms, and he completely overhauls it.
But how did he actually fix the supply problem? Because he couldn't just invent saltpeter out of thin air.
He fundamentally industrialized the biological decay process. Lavoisier abolished the droit de fouille, stopping the barnyard destruction. Instead, he instituted artificial nitraries, or saltpeter beds.
What do those look like?
He instructed workers to build massive, layered beds of rotting organic matter, manure, plant waste, and ashes mixed with limestone. By strictly controlling the moisture, the exposure to air, and the alkaline balance, he created ideal environments for nitrifying bacteria to thrive. He essentially turned saltpeter production into a controlled, scientific agriculture.
He farmed the bacteria, and the results were staggering. He did it so efficiently that France went from having a desperate gunpowder shortage to producing a massive, high-quality surplus in just a few years.
And we know where that surplus went.
Exactly. Who happened to benefit from that French surplus? The American Revolution. The French exported massive amounts of Lavoisier's top-tier powder to the American colonies, playing a decisive role in their victory over the British.
Lavoisier's intervention is a perfect illustration of how the history of gunpowder isn't just a history of generals and tactics. It is a history of logistics, chemistry, and state bureaucracy.
So, Lavoisier solves the military bottleneck. Empires now have tens of thousands of barrels of this highly optimized corn powder. But because it deflagrates, because it pushes rather than violently shatters, people start realizing that this massive military surplus is actually the perfect industrial tool.
Right.
Which brings us to the surprisingly bizarre, non-lethal side of gunpowder. So what does this all mean for you and me?
Well, it's low Bryceland's that pushing quality made it the absolute best tool for mining and quarrying fragile, monumental stone.
Right, like if you are an architect and you want a giant, pristine block of slate for a roof or a massive slab of marble for a statue, you can't use high explosives. Dynamite or TNT would turn a beautiful marble slab into useless gravel.
Exactly.
Gunpowder, if packed correctly into drill holes, just gently nudges the rock face apart, leaving the stone perfectly intact.
It was also used in some incredibly ambitious, though misguided, attempts at engineering. In 1673, the brilliant Dutch physicist Christian Huygens literally tried to build a gunpowder engine.
Wait, really? A gunpowder engine?
Yeah. Before steam power was perfected, he thought he could create a mechanical vacuum inside a cylinder by detonating small charges of gunpowder, and then use that vacuum to drive a piston.
I am assuming a car powered by tiny cannon blasts didn't catch on.
It failed completely. The mechanics of constantly feeding powder into a hot cylinder and dealing with that corrosive soot we talked about earlier made it completely impossible.
That makes sense.
But the sheer versatility of the powder in emergency situations is astonishing. Fast forward to 1809, after the grueling Battle of Aspern-Essling. Napoleon's famous chief surgeon, Dominique Jean Larrey, found himself with thousands of wounded, starving soldiers and a severe lack of salt to preserve or flavor their food.
Okay.
He actually used gunpowder to season a horse-meat bouillon.
Wait, why wouldn't an explosive taste good? That sounds incredibly toxic.
Well, it connects right back to the chemistry we discussed at the beginning. The primary ingredient in gunpowder is saltpeter, potassium nitrate. It is literally a salt. It has a slightly bitter, salty taste, and more importantly, nitrates are incredibly effective at curing and preserving meat. It's the exact same chemical reason we use nitrates in hot dogs and cured sausages today. Larry knew his chemistry, and he used his artillery supplies to safely feed his patients.
Okay, seasoning your soup with artillery powder is a whole new level of hardcore. And the weird uses don't even stop there. British sailors out at sea used it for what's called traumatic tattooing.
Traumatic tattoo.
Yeah, if they didn't have access to proper ink, they would prick their skin with needles and vigorously rub fine gunpowder into the wound to create a permanent blue-black mark.
Wow, I had no idea.
And even moving into the modern era, you have artists like the Los Angeles-based Ed Ruscha, who literally used gunpowder as a visual medium, rubbing it into paper to create incredibly textured artwork in the 1960s.
That is amazing. It is a profound reminder that technology is rarely used for just one intended purpose, you know? It permeates every level of society, from warfare to cuisine to art.
So, to recap the journey we've been on today for you, the listener, we started with an accidental Taoist medicine containing arsenic and honey that blew up alchemists' houses. We saw it evolve into a global propellant that sparked endless translation debates over smoky lances and flying eggs.
Right.
We learned how the vibration of a wooden cart could ruin a medieval army's day until they learned to make explosive espresso clumps. We watched a French tax collector save the American Revolution by scientifically rotting manure instead of tearing down peasant barnyards. And we saw how the powder that sank armadas was also used to extract the stone of our monuments and season a surgeon's horse soup.
It is quite the resume. And if we connect all of this to the bigger picture, it raises an important and somewhat provocative question for you to mull over.
Oh, definitely.
Gunpowder changed the world purely by accident as a byproduct of a search for eternal life. It was a complete tangent to the original goal. So look around at the hyper-advanced technology we are developing today, from artificial intelligence algorithms to synthetic biology and gene editing. These are tools we are designing to solve very specific contemporary problems. What current technology might accidentally become the fire medicine that completely rewires human history 1,000 years from now?
It is a staggering thought. The next world-altering substance or code might already be sitting in a lab somewhere, totally misunderstood by the people who created it. Just like those Tang Dynasty alchemists, staring at their burnt hands in a smoldering house, completely unaware that their failed medicine for immortality had just given birth to the most lethal and transformative force in human history.